to you. I think at this point we will open it up to any other comments from the fish agencies.
Yeah, I'll start off. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Modern technology. Good morning, Chair
No,
Marcus.
it's also the buddy system. The person next
There
to
you
you
go.
has to help you with the button and
Agencies work
keep him
together.
close.
I am Garwin Yep, Branch Chief of Water Operations and Delta Consultations for the National Marine Fisheries Service. This morning, I thought I'd go a different route and talk about not just cold water pull, this amorphous concept of how much is enough. The more we get, the more we keep asking for. So I thought I'd go back to 2011. 2011, depending on who we talk to, some people characterize this as a year-class failure for a winter run. I think it was back in 1992 that we had the lowest escapement of winter run. 2011 was right there, about 841 adult winter run that came back. So like I said, subject to interpretation as to whether that was a year-class failure or not. So the life cycle of winter run, generally 3 years before they come back. So the progeny of the 2011 cohort are coming back this year. Nothing definitive as they're still coming upstream, but what I heard is that it's a small population for this year. So very important for us to sustain a cold water pull, provide for temperature and flow requirements for their entire life cycle in fresh water. That was in 2011. Fast forward to 2013, dry year. We had the opposite spectrum. We had over 6,000 winter run that came up. Banner year in recent history, but pretty slim pickings compared to when Red Bluff Diversion Dam came in 1967 and certainly before Keswick and Shasta. But the highest escapement over the last 6 or 7 years. That was 2013. So the progeny of the 2013 brood year made their way downstream this water year. So this water year, third year of the drought, they were subjected to drought situations, low flows, probably clear water. There were estimates through the juvenile production estimate of approximately 4 million juvenile winter run at Red Bluff Diversion Dam. And based on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service rotary screw trap monitoring in Red Bluff, somewhere around 1.5 million were estimated. So what happened to the rest of the fish? Same scenario down to Knight's Landing, Tisdale rotary screw traps. Were they there? Did they bypass the traps and not get sampled? Or are there just less this year? We don't really know. Same with exports. At the fish facilities, not very many that showed up. So did they not make it into the Central and South Delta? Not very many show up. We're not sure exactly. So that was 2013. 2014, now we're looking at a forecast and projection of about 890,000 acre feet end of September Shasta storage. We would like and require through the RPA 1.9 million, so it's even less than half. Going through the summer this year, we're looking at a Clear Creek temperature compliance point for winter run needs. And that temperature compliance point may be met through up to September, probably a portion of September. But as far as winter run spawning, egg incubation, and alevin development, we need that temperature to be consistent 56 degrees through September. So almost out of the gravel, not quite. So what happens to those fish? Do they know they get out or will they die? So cold water pull for this year is very important. Through the drought operations plan that was finalized April 8th, I think it was, we have a winter run contingency plan. So what if we're looking at a year-class failure that Clear Creek will not be met or somewhere even upstream of that will not be met? We're talking about 100% hatchery production. Maybe reintroduction to Battle Creek this year. Whether it's ready or not, we don't know, but we need to put the adult fish and the eggs somewhere. Move the eggs to McLeod or Shasta hatchery. We need to do something if nature, in terms of the main stem Sacramento River, will not provide all of its habitat needs. So our guard is a little let down now. There's probably some semblance of temperature compliance, but we're still pretty concerned about cold water throughout the summer. And then as I mentioned, the forecast in our April 18th letter, back to reclamation, the forecast for end of September is 890,000 acre feet. So that sets us up for next year being slim pickings going into the winter, and only Mother Nature can tell us what's going to happen then. So, you know, the million-dollar question, and that's why we're here, but what I thought I'd do is provide you guys with just some food for thought as you guys consider and deliberate on curtailments, no curtailments, or, you know, how many and where. Thank you. And I need to leave, so I apologize for that.
Chairman Marcus, board members, Carl Wilcox, California Department of Fish and Game. I don't know that I have anything to add. Garwin gave you a real good accounting of what the situation is, particularly for winter run, and the importance of cold water pool maintenance in Shasta Reservoir, and the effects that, you know, existing operations and depletions have on that, and the importance of being able to achieve the objectives of the drought operations plan relative to cold water pool at the end of September, and the kind of touchy nature of what we'll do come September and October, and the fact, you know, and part of that is the fact that there are contingency plans in place for winter run to look at other actions, you know, kind of extraordinary actions to make sure that this year's cohort survives and is carried on into the subsequent years. So with that, that's...
Good morning, Chair Marcus, members of the board. I'm Mike Chakowski, Fish and Wildlife Service, and I really don't have anything to add to the expressions of concern about cold water pool for anadromous fishes that my colleagues have expressed. Thank you.
I want to turn to my colleagues for questions now, either of our staff or these guys. Yeah.
And this is just for my clearer understanding of the contracts that you have with your contractors, and what your obligations were, and because if it looks like, and that's what I'm hearing, that you're not going to be able to meet the obligations of the contracts, that's the reason that we're needing to consider curtailing folks who thought they might not ever have to be curtailed. Or at least, you know, they didn't plan for this until this year. Is that, do I have a accurate understanding that there's your uncertainty about meeting your contract obligations, not just for this year, but moving into next year?
I'll try. I can't get into too many details on our contracts. I'm not a contract specialist, but in relation to that question, we have settlement contracts for our contractors, both water rights settlements contracts for contractors both north of the Delta and south of the Delta. Recently, most of the concern has been for our south of the Delta water rights exchange contractors and settlement contractors there, and just trying to ensure that we could get enough water to them to meet a 75% supply that's within our contracts with them. The other, and this curtailment, to my knowledge, is not designed around trying to create more water for export for that supply. The other set of contractors north of the Delta are the Sacramento River settlement contractors, and we have contracts for them to furnish 100% of their contract amount as long as the Shasta inflow generally is above 3.2 million acre feet. There's one other criteria that's linked to that, but that's the general criteria we use. And if Shasta inflow is less than 3.2, we have the contractual obligation to furnish 75%. Just recently, in early May, through a lot of discussion with the contractors in the Sac Valley, we worked on an arrangement where they were able to, and this is in coordination with the fishery agencies too, but they voluntarily tried to, or actually did, we're seeing the result of it now, delay some of the flood up of the rice fields and try to delay some of the demand on the system until mid-May and later. The thought there was trying to match their water requirements and when we would have to lease the water to be more consistent or more in line with our temperature operation at Shasta. So they're working with us and trying to accomplish that. And along with that, we thought that with the supply we saw from our forecasts of April that we would be able to get them to the 75% contractual amount. So right now, we're operating assuming that they're going to, or we'll be able to get them their 75% contractual supply north of the Delta. And that's absent any potential curtailment action by the board.
And just to add, I guess on DWR side, yes, as far as upstream, we are meeting our contractual terms with our water rights settlement contractors there. We are meeting the contractual terms with North Delta Water Agency. The modification that we are requesting actually would put the compliance in alignment with what that North Delta Water Agency contract is. But I wouldn't say that that's what our focus is here. Our focus is the objectives that we outlined on in the drought operations plan, that the second slide, as far as looking at those, trying to protect those most critical needs going into 2015, which would include the health and safety issues, ensure we have enough storage for salinity control, or improve our chances for salinity control next year without the use of other management tools such as the drought barriers, and also the cold water pool, of course. So those are the most critical purposes I think that we're focused on.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? So a follow-up question to what you just said, in developing the drought operation plan in order to achieve those three main objectives, what assumption did you put in terms of your ability to deliver contract water? In other words, did you calculate into developing the drought operation plan the possibility of reduction and not meeting those contract obligations?
Well, early on in January, the hydrologic criteria that's in those contracts were at least for DWR, were indicating shortages that would occur to those folks. And so that was the assumption early on, that they would be curtailed. Now, the improvements in February and March were just enough to eliminate some of those curtailments. So that's, if you recall, in the drought operations plan, we had various scenarios. The most worst case, which included emergency barriers in the Delta for salinity control, and so under those more severe scenarios, would have included some shortages to those settlement contractors. Now, things improved just enough to remove the need for some of these. So one of those was any shortages to our settlement contractors, and also the need for the salinity drought barriers. So that's how that was taken into account. We were looking at various scenarios in the drought operations plan.
I'll say on the Central Valley project side, when we developed the operations plan, unless we were hydrologically limited, and that just because of dryness, there was not enough water, no water there to deliver to our contractors, we were always assuming that, or we're working towards delivering that 75% as long as Shasta influence less than that 3.2 million acre feet.
I have a follow-up question on this. I recall the weeks, if not maybe even a month, that it took to put that plan together, and I know there was a lot of angst south of Delta because the exchange contractors were, waiting to find out, what the number would be. And as I recall, there was a lot of time spent on modeling, wanting to make sure that, before any announcement was made, that you had the information that you needed, that the Bureau needed in order to provide for that decision. So what went into the modeling on this, on the issue of curtailments? Did you model for term 91, existing term 91, and also curtailments, because I know we had on all these workshops and updates before the board, what would normally follow the real-time team was that we usually get an update on curtailments as well.
I'm thinking probably the most intensive modeling I can think of when we were working on the supplies that we had south of the Delta were, excuse me, so a lot of the temperature modeling runs we were doing on the Sacramento River. And that was, I think, some of the things Garvin was referring to. We were trying to determine whether our planned operation would provide this protection through August, well, through September is really what National Marine Fisheries would desire. So, and we were looking at how the release pattern and depletions in the valley might help us achieve that goal. We really did not consider or include anything for a potential curtailment. I think even at this time, we're not certain how that might affect our operations. And with Term 91 too, Term 91 is in place so that the other diverters do not affect or make use of our storage withdrawals. So I guess in a sense you can say that we considered Term 91, but it is the operation that we modeled and included.
Right. Can our staff come back too? There are enough chairs. I'd like to, we are gonna, I didn't say, we are gonna take a mid-morning short bio break, and we will take a lunch break. I'm not going to put words in anyone's mouth, but I want to try and crystallize what we're here about for the audience and people who are listening, subject to the comments, which I think we all find incredibly helpful in challenging circumstance. So is it fair to say, that sounds like I'm asking a question I know the answer to, and I don't mean it that way. What we're talking, obviously the need to do curtailments is something that's out there. It's in the water code. People have been expecting it, as I said this morning. There's a complexity to it because some people have a mix of water rights, contract rights, or their contract rights are in exchange for their senior water rights, et cetera. So folks out there know what their rights are, and hopefully have looked at all the options. So is it fair to say that what we're focusing on right now is trying to figure out what method we're going to use for curtailments? And the presentation this morning from the projects and the fish agencies is to bring us up to speed on the very difficult trade-offs they made in trying to figure out how to protect storage for those three uses. That's what this sort of first phase of the drought focus has been. And so the question then would be, in looking at this methodology, should we be erring on the side of protecting the storage that's been cut to the bone in a lot of, as some people would look at it, particularly for fish needs down the line? Where do we assign the risk in the case that the data isn't perfect in terms of our knowledge of depletions? Again, you all tried to look at and estimate depletions, but it's not perfect. We can take the data we have, we can bring in the information that people give us. We love when people come to us with voluntary agreements that also acknowledge the need for fish and downstream water rights holders. They're not that helpful when people don't, because it's most helpful when people give us stuff that allows us to discharge our responsibility as opposed to something that otherwise sounds good. And I know people are working hard on that. So you have this range of ways to try and figure out how to implement. But I'm trying to place what our choice is in this agenda item, which is to give you feedback on which seems like the best method of discharging our obligation to implement curtailments in an extraordinary drought, right? So option 3 is the one that errs on the side of protecting storage. Option 4 puts the burden on storage, but with the end result of being wrong that the fish get our toast at the end of the year. But I don't know if some of your contract allocations are too. And so it's just an interesting balance. But it's a question of choice in an imperfect world. So can you help frame that for everyone?
We're competing to see who's going to answer. Oh,
Well, you could
maybe
both do
we'll
it, and then
both
we could see if
answer.
that eliminates. I mean, this is a very hard issue. That's why I'm trying to frame the issue. It's not to be or not to be. It is how.
Yeah, so
is the
different ways,
question.
hopefully not with different answers. The option 4 isn't so much putting the burden on the storage, it just does less to relieve the operations of the project so that storage would be depleted. It doesn't do anything additional to what's already there. So I'm not sure if that's what you had said. Option 4.
It's a question of what if we're wrong based on the data we have. Since
I
the
think
data
the
we have is
question-
imperfect, it's better than it used to be, that's for sure, because of the '09 legislation, but it's still not perfect.
I think maybe the answer that you're wanting is what are we protecting? In option 1, 2, and 4, we're protecting previously stored water releases by the projects. In option 3, we're also asking other diverters to contribute to meeting delta outflow requirements, which is typically how we assign responsibility for flow requirements. The delta is a unique case where the projects have agreed over the years to backstop those requirements through the various agreements they've established. So that's really our circumstances such that we should be asking others to contribute in this very dry conditions such that the projects have adequate storage to meet all of the demands for that storage going into next year and throughout the rest of this year for repelling salinity in the delta, meeting fishery flow needs and meeting health and safety needs of the project. So that's really the question, is between whether others should help to contribute to the different delta outflow requirements in order to preserve that stored water for other uses that are needed throughout the season, or whether the projects should continue to entirely meet the delta outflow requirements, which is sort of the case with the other options in which are designed to curtail the diversion of that previously stored water such that it's not illegally diverted. So all of the options involve that. Option 3 is the enhanced kind of protection of storage option.
But can you help I guess what I'm hearing, though, in the protection of storage, the risk of not doing it is that they end up with way less water and they either can't protect the fish or they can't protect salinity control into the next year or whatnot. I'm trying to crystallize
I think
the
so.
impact of being wrong on these options.
And I think, let me tease out just two pieces. Let's assume that all the modeling that has gone into what the Department and Bureau have done is exactly right, because depletions are, they're a hard thing to arrive at. We know what we put in at the top, and then we see what comes out at the bottom. But people are frequently shocked to know we don't have all the inputs and outputs. We don't really know everything that goes on. It's really just a difference term. So we use average values from previous years, and then occasionally for that reason we can be a bit surprised, at least on the short term. It might even out through a season, but we were surprised last year because depletions went up very quickly to a very high level, and then they came back down because it was very dry last spring, and then everybody turned on their pumps at the same time, and they were racing to maintain releases to account for those depletions. This year we were fortunate that we're going into this season, the irrigation season, we've had rains. So we're not seeing such a huge increase, and yet what we've seen is in April and May, we're at the upper end of the releases from Shasta that were contemplated in the drought operations plan, because depletions are at the high end already, even though it was envisioned that, well, we're getting people to defer, delay their diversions, delay flooding up rice fields. So depletions are on the high end of what we thought. Does that mean that they're still going to go up higher then when we get into the season when they're expecting to make up for it, or not? And it's an open question, which perhaps the Department of Bureau could speak a little bit more to the uncertainty in that. So that's one element. Is what we think we know correct? And if that's the case, we know perfectly, well, then we're going to get to the end of September storage there, and there we are. The other element is if we're wrong about that, we could end up in a much worse place. The other element is that, as you heard from Garwin Yip, is that we're already in a very bad place. We should be doing everything possible to maybe bump that up a bit, because even what we know about depletions are perhaps at such a high level because people are diverting when they should not be under their water right. And with curtailments, that would not be happening and we'd end up in a better place. So there's those two elements, both the uncertainty element and also let's do what we need to do to end up in a better place.
And maybe just to add to that uncertainty element, just to bring in that this option was intended to give you an opportunity to consider or not whether it's reasonable, given the two areas that Les just raised, in addition to the changes that we've made through the temporary urgency change petitions this year. So when you compound the two areas that Les raised, along with the changes that we have made, are we in fact perhaps in a different sort of a year? And this option is intended to give you an opportunity to consider that.
So I appreciate, Madam Chair, what you're doing to kind of help frame the issue. So, yeah, so I would just throw, well, first of all, a question. The depletions from last year and the concern about, you know, what if the modelers got it wrong? Last year, we didn't have curtailments throughout the entire system, throughout the entire Sacramento-San Joaquin watershed, correct?
That's correct, except for term 91.
Right, okay. So one of the options that we are considering is, I guess, sort of the traditional curtailments. Option 1 and option 2 would also provide some degree of protection. And so the thing that I would just maybe add is looking at this issue of, on each of the options, who takes the risk, and you know, what the erring on the side of caution for the fish. I would add to that sort of, and I think there's an attempt here in the slides to kind of look at some of the other issues, and that would be who would be responsible, and the impact if we went through, say, option 3 or option 4 in terms, because the slides talk about some additional water, but I think we need to quantify exactly how much water, who would be taking that risk. So it's basically shifting the risk from the projects to other diverters.
So actually, option 4 is the same as option 1 and 2 as far as who's responsible for what. It's just using what we think is probably better data, calculated data, rather than the reported use data that we have from the statements that we get from the different water diverters, which we're aware are not, you know, highly accurate, especially in a year like this when it's drier than it has been in the past, you know, how accurate that's going to be. So that's the real difference between option 4 and option 2, and the difference with option 1 is doing it through a regulatory approach versus a regulation versus our existing curtailment authorities.
Right, but the data under option 1 versus option 4, there is a difference in terms of how things would be calculated. So
Right.
there must be a way to quantify what the difference is in terms of the water. How much water are we talking about?
Oh, how much water are we talking about? So we have taken a look at that, and for the remainder of the water year, we're expecting that, you know, as John O'Hagan has pointed out in his presentations to you, that all post-14 water diverters should probably be curtailed for the remainder of the season. So
Either way,
yeah,
no
for
matter how we do it.
post-1914 diverters, I'm not sure that the difference between option 3 and option 4 is really distinct for the remainder of the water year because of the fact that there simply just is not natural flow available for those diversions. It would come into play when it starts to rain again, and whether, you know, whether those parties would contribute to delta outflow or merely just not be able to divert previously stored water. So that's sort of the difference. But for the remainder of the water, this water year going into September, we expect, you know, not much additional inflow, and for curtailment to be necessary for most post-1914 diverters.
But even pre. I thought even pre.
And pre-1914 diverters. So,
Right.
And that's simply based on availability, not any issue with whether parties are contributing to delta outflow as well. So in those instances, for the remainder of the water year, we're expecting the projects are still going to have to meet the delta outflow requirements from stored water releases. What we're looking at for the remainder of the water year is reducing the stored water releases they have to make to serve illegal diverters who don't have a contract with the projects and are taking the water because they have no other way of knowing that that water is not available. It's in the river. It seems to be available. We don't have a system for notifying those diverters that the water isn't available. So, you know, in part, all of the options provide us some mechanism for notifying the diverters that water isn't available. We think the option, the real-time information that you get through the Term 91 type process is more accurate likely than our reported use data. That's
Right, but the,
Right.
if there's a curtailment notice through option 1 or option 2, they would be told that they can't divert. So regardless of whether they know if that's stored water or who knows what it is, they've been told they cannot divert.
That's correct.
Right, okay.
Right, that's why there
But
wouldn't be
our-
a difference
our,
in impact for them.
how refined we can get with those estimates is, you know, less likely with the traditional curtailment methodology.
So you have to envision what the river would look like without the projects. If you're trying to envision when the data would say curtail, you're envisioning the river without any stored water, and it wouldn't be there enough for everybody along the seniority system.
Not
That's what's
accounted
hard
for.
about it. It's somewhat abstract, that what we have to do, but it's a good problem to have because we have the project, which has been a great boon to the state. Other questions?
There was, can you go back a couple slides to the Sacramento Valley graph? Yeah. So I think this speaks to a point that Les touched on before, but in terms of this is an example of what you were talking about as far as our ability to estimate depletion is sort of a plus and sort of a subtraction exercise as opposed to real-time information. And yet, you're saying, you know, one of the benefits of something like option 4 is to use real-time information to inform the decisions versus reported water use. So I'm a little confused, and just that, you know, our ability to quantify depletions, such as seen here, it's beginning in, you know, the early May. We're starting to see, you know, less water going down into the delta versus what's being removed for in-basin use. And so what is our confidence level in getting real-time diversion information if we're relying on such kind of course level analysis to estimate depletion?
We'd be looking at gauge data to determine, you know, what are the depletions in the system and who needs to be curtailed. So it wouldn't be, you wouldn't be dependent on diverters notifying us when they're diverting because they're, you know, although the Department and Bureau do have, they do have, I think most of their diverters, they are aware of when they're diverting. So
The
for
contract.
their diverters under their contracts, they have some ability for more real-time reporting. And that's something we would hopefully be able to bring into the Term 91 process if we modified it to account for contract deliveries.
Mm-hmm. And looking at this graph, just real quick, you mentioned, you know, last spring the hydrologic conditions, you had probably had a larger depletion graph in 2013 than we're seeing here in 2014 because of the recent storms. Or when you look at these data, because I don't have the context of experience, you know, is this alarming or fairly natural to see at the turn of May this kind of a diversion between in-basin withdrawal and discharge to the delta?
I think the department can also answer, but yes, typically once it turns, and especially once we get into the irrigation season, those curves move up quite quickly.
Right.
This is not as quickly as it did last year because of for the reasons that I described. But this is all, you know, actually gauge. This is information we have in terms of releases and gauges. So there's no forecasting here. So the problem becomes in terms of the uncertainty. It's like, well, this is what we know is happening right now. How is this going to continue? What's going to be the spread on this into the future? And we have model estimates of what it will be, but to the extent that we're underestimating those depletions, then it can, at this point, in absent curtailment, only come from one location, and that's storage.
And we do have some slides of previous years what the supplemental project water releases have been, and they've been quite large. Maybe Rich can give you an order of magnitude of how large they've been. But you know, once they go up, I mean, it tends to be straight up.
So to piggyback on that, sorry, how do these depletions compare to projections in the drought operation plan?
That's the right question.
Yeah, okay, so just general, like you said, piggybacking off the previous comments, and I think Les, has it right, that in all but the wettest years, this is a transition that takes place. It's just a matter of when, the timing. So I think last year was probably about the earliest that we've ever seen that transition occur, and so that was, things were ahead by 2-3 weeks than what they are this year. So that transition took place in mid-April, early to mid-April last year. We're seeing it in, this is fairly typical, but like I said, it varies significantly from year to year on when that transition takes place. And I'm sorry, your question.
Your projections.
Oh, projections, yes, for this year and the drought operations plan. It's. I wouldn't say that they're. It's a little difficult because those projections are based on monthly averages. So until we see the end of what happens here in May, we won't know for sure. If they're certainly tracking, I'd say, closer to those 90% projections rather than the 50% projections from the drought operations plan.
Are they higher, lower?
Again, they're tracking probably similar to the 90% as far as the depletion rate, and those were based on So those forecasts that we received are based on a combination of what kind of snowpack we had at that point in time, plus historical, in the case of the 90% case, it would be historically those very driest years, the 10% driest years, was the assumption moving forward. And what that would add to those runoff projections in combination with what the actual unique snowpack looked like this year. So that's what that 90% projection was. And again, until we see kind of how, if these depletions continue to increase as we go through the rest of this month, it could very well be drier than what the overall monthly average for May may be drier than what our projections were under the drought operations plan, but we don't know for sure. There was some sign of maybe stabilizing a bit, but again, we just have to wait to see what the actual numbers come out to be for this month. I don't know, Paul, if you have any.
Excuse me, just to add a little bit on the depletions in the Sacramento Valley and the chart we had there, but I think probably the more correct term is accretion depletions, because what we're looking at and talking about there is the net result of the unregulated, unimpaired flow that enters the Sacramento Valley between our reservoir releases and Freeport, so that the other creek flow and everything, and actually that also includes in our analysis, and I think a lot of it links to the coordinated operating agreement, but that accretion depletions in our analysis includes the Yuba system too. So when you say, is this different than other years? Well, yes, because probably one of the biggest differences is all the other creek flows this year are just drying up much more quickly and more substantially than in wetter years or more normal type years, how we may put it. So just keep that in mind.
A few.
So just for context,
Yeah, go ahead.
Last year, supplemental project water we've calculated was as high as 17,000 CFS in the middle of the summer. So if this year's anything like last year, there will be a substantial amount of supplemental project water release to meet in-basin demands and delta outflow requirements.
Right. Just a few questions, and then maybe these seem like they're going to be helpful to me. I hope they are to other people. When we're looking at, and I know the San Joaquin's can be different than Sacramento. Can you or you all give sort of a sense to us, again, knowing there's an overlap in some cases, a sense of what percentage of the flow in the river in the summertime are storage releases versus in-basin non-contract water rights holders? Is there a way to do that roughly, or does it totally vary by year?
So this is John. Yeah, I think it'd be 100% storage releases in the summer, middle of the summer.
Always, or most of the time,
I'd
not
say
just in terrible?
most of the years, in all but the wettest years.
So the non-contract water rights holders are familiar with not having water in the summer?
We're always providing those storage releases in the summer, so they're not familiar with not having those storage releases.
Because they
unless
take
prior to the-
advantage of your storage releases, even though in theory it's not their water? Sorry to put it bluntly.
There, if I can, maybe a bit of a back and forth, a modified answer.
trying to
When
eliminate
you see, yeah, that's a good.
regular person questions.
When you see those lines, when what has been described, when the reservoirs turn over, it means they're certainly supplementing the system now because releases from storage are in excess of what's coming in terms of the inflow. But there is, if you just were to let that water pass through or kind of put that at the bottom, there is some natural flow in the system that
Generally,
will
coming
work-
from springs
coming-
and things
well-
like that.
Well, coming from higher in the watershed and throughout,
Right.
that is meeting some demand, and
Okay, right,
then
that
just
is my question.
it depends on where you start ordering it, which really gets to the crux of some of the curtailments in terms of, is that, again, as we discussed in the item yesterday, is that at the floor for providing for the delta outflow, other things like that, or is it for the most senior demands on the system? So maybe John wants to provide, so we're not giving different answers. I think the answer is, even in the driest year, there is some natural flow in the system, but it is being greatly augmented by storage as you get into the season.
Yeah, I think that qualifier is correct. So it goes back to actually that bar graph that I showed in one of those slides. So there's always going to be some of the natural flow that's in the system,
Right.
but it is definitely insufficient to meet all of the in-basin uses. So it will be some part of those in-basin uses, but it's unclear how much and which in-basin uses it'd be enough to meet.
Okay. Next question. Can you paint a picture of, so you've pointed out that post-14s would be curtailed sort of no matter what under either system. Can you explain exactly how this will impact the pre-14s? And I know you have even more gradations than this, and riparians. In practice, you're a farmer, you've got riparian rights. Talk about the difference in these options.
Well, so this regulation, the regulations we're talking about now wouldn't affect riparians, but moving into the future, if there's a need to curtail riparians, if we were to take an option like option 4, which didn't account for contribution to delta outflow, then our riparian if we were to take an option like option 3 for riparians and pre-14s in the future, not what we're talking about today, but in the future, we could curtail riparians entirely as a group to meet that delta outflow requirement. In any of the other options, it would be a correlative reduction
And we'd have
to
to
their
figure it out.
use, which would be
Similar, but
fairly difficult to implement. So our ability to curtail riparians sort of depends on what starting point you're looking at. If you're looking at all natural flow is available for diversion by riparians, then you have to divvy that flow up, figure out a system to divvy that flow up amongst, the thousands of riparians in the Delta watershed. Versus if you had the base flow requirement on the bottom and that's to be met first, then there's the possibility that as a group, those diverters could be curtailed.
then talk to me a little bit more about the difference between 3 and 4 in practice to people.
So the primary difference between 3 and 4 is alternative 3 would involve other diverters being curtailed when there was inadequate natural flow to meet delta outflows, and the projects were releasing stored water to meet that delta outflow requirement. So it would involve contributions to delta outflow by other parties in the system to help repel salinity. That would, again, preserve more stored water for the projects to meet salinity, the needs to repel salinity in the future, and to meet the health and safety needs and fish and wildlife needs.
Right, but if the stored water, okay, this may seem an obvious question, and I may know the answer, but just, again, I'm trying to illuminate this either for myself or for people who may not be totally read in to this world. If the projects are releasing water now, and they will be releasing water through the rest of the summer, does that then mean everybody's just curtailed, or all post-14s are? I mean, I'm trying to figure out the difference in terms of how it's going to impact a person.
Right, so right now, I think for the remainder of the water year, there wouldn't, for post-1914 diverters, there wouldn't be a difference between option 3 and option 4. The difference between option 3, because there is not natural flow available for post-1914 diverters according to our calculations. The difference would come into play when it starts to rain again, and whether those diverters could start to divert as soon as it starts raining and there was natural flow to satisfy the pre-14s and riparians, if they could start to divert, or if they would need to contribute to meeting delta outflow, which is how most flow requirements in other systems are based, is their bypass requirements. The projects have a unique responsibility to release stored water. In most systems, there isn't this requirement to release stored water. So it would treat the delta more like other systems with option 3. Option 4 would just purely protect that previously stored water that the projects are releasing and senior water and water needed to meet senior water right holders' needs.
So the impact is more later in the year than now?
Yeah, I mean, there's no difference between option 1, 2, and 4 as far as, theoretically, as far as who should be curtailed. Option 3 would be the only, would cut somewhat deeper than option 1, 2, and 4. It's just the difference is the regulation and the calculation methodology between those options.
I don't understand it that way. So if I could just ask a follow-up on that.
That's what.
So I don't see a difference between option 1 and 2 in terms of how things are calculated. But for option 4, okay, when I first heard about these different options, I was always, I was picturing the delta, diverters in the delta. But we are not just talking about the delta, in the delta. We're talking about the entire watershed. So taking an example of a diverter on the Tuolumne, in option 1 and 2, the determinations, the calculations would be based on those charts that John O'Hagan's been showing us for the last 2 months as to when a diverter would be cut off. The focus is that watershed, say the watershed in the Tuolumne watershed. Under option 4, the focus on the calculation is the projects and the what's going into the delta. So the focus, in order to determine what a diverter upstream on the Tuolumne, when they would be cut off, it wouldn't be related to the Tuolumne specifically, it would be related to the delta, correct?
Not necessarily. I think you could treat option 1, if your intent, it depends on your intent. If your intent is to protect senior water right holders within a specific basin, then you're correct. If your intent is to protect previously stored water and treat the delta like an interconnected basin, which is the assumption as far as these options are concerned.
I'm not talking about intent one way or the other. I'm talking about the effect. The effect of 4 is that the calculations would be based on project water releases in order to meet outflow, and those green lines, I think it's the green lines of what's going in. Maybe it was the blue lines, I can't remember. So the focus on the calculation would be the delta, as opposed to under 1 and 2, the calculation could be different because it would just be entirely dependent. And I know, just even looking at, say, the Merced River is in, a much worse situation than, say, the Tuolumne. The cutoff points would be different between the Tuolumne and the Merced, but not using option 4. Everyone would be treated the same in terms of the cutoff period, and it would be based on the situation in the delta as opposed to the individual watersheds.
And I think I will agree with some of what you're saying, in that it's a delta. Everything we're looking at here is delta watershed-wide curtailment. So it's distinct from looking at any tributary in that it has to take into account all downstream users of water that might have senior water right.
Which
riparian
includes people in the
pre-14,
delta.
Which includes people in the
Right.
delta. So that once you look at a delta-wide curtailment, then that curtailment could very well hit earlier than something that is just tributary specific. So it has nothing to do with the projects or other, it's because it's a delta-wide curtailment, and you have to take into account all of the senior water right holders that are downstream that would,
Right.
in the order of priority, would get that water before a more junior diverter upstream.
So
I
it's
wanted
the
to just-
same under option 1 and 2. I
Yes,
think the goal would be for a delta-wide curtailment under those options. You could have delta-wide curtailments under option 1 and 2, or you could have tributary-based curtailment options under options 1 and 2. But what we're proposing is a delta-wide curtailment.
well,
so
then
that may be your confusion.
Maybe I don't understand it. Then in that instance, it'd be helpful to get the charts because I understand the charts that John's been showing. So it'd be helpful if we could see something like option 1, take some sample watersheds, option 1 through 4, and what it would look like.
Well, so to compare, are you suggesting to look at an option 1 that's for delta wide, and then also an option 1 that is just for tributary?
Well, not option 1 delta wide. I mean, the options, I thought option 1 was what John had been presenting, what staff had been presenting all along. So is option 1 different than what staff has been talking about all along?
We have those curves for the delta watershed as well that John has developed that are based on the reported use data and the supply for the delta as a whole that treats the delta as an interconnected basin. So, there's two different ways of looking at it. What is needed within a specific watershed versus, so you could curtail a senior water right holder in the Sacramento River Basin and not a junior diverter in the San Joaquin River Basin if you were only to look at it at a tributary by tributary basis. If you look at it as, treating the delta as an interconnected basin, that junior right holder on the San Joaquin should be curtailed before the senior.
Okay, so here's the problem that I have with that approach. Since January, end of January, first part of February, we have been looking at these charts, watershed by watershed. That's what everyone in the room thought we were going to do. That's what everybody out on the web that's watching this thought we were going to do. So I am confused. I'm trying to understand the impact between with these different options. And so is it no longer on the table that we are going to be looking at curtailments watershed by watershed?
Can I just add a friendly amendment? The watershed by watershed should include the impact on the seniors in the delta.
Oh, absolutely. But
Right.
it was my, it was my understanding that that's what was being considered when we got those charts.
Board Member Diadamo, Mr. O'Hagan had yesterday had presented some of the watershed by